I'm Al Roxburgh. I'll let Martin introduce himself. We are both part of the team that edits and brings the Journal of Missional Practice together, along with Sarah Jane Walker and Mary Publicover. And this morning we want to host a conversation entitled From Exile to Earthquake. Interesting conversation. But Martin, you may want to introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah, I'm principal of Mission College, which operates mainly in the United Kingdom, a little bit in various parts of the continent of Europe. So we have numerous students, just under 200 students in various campuses around the country, which we hope will result in more people taking part in church planting and missional congregations around the UK. So that's my main occupation, but part of the conversation that I'm having with Al centers around the Journal for Missional Practice, which is hosting this conversation today.
And part of our conversation today is really around a large question which the journal in its latest issue is beginning to address, called What's Next? And it's an issue which is not only about the larger culture, but also what's happening to us as churches, as leaders, as congregations, as simply neighbors, as we live in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis. We're beginning to ask, what's next? What happens when we come out of the quarantine, and what does it mean for leaders, and how as church leaders do we see this? So that's the context of the conversation. Anything you want to add to that, Martin?
Yeah, well, let's just dive straight in, because you and I wrote a book just over a year ago. And one of the things that we were wrestling with is this issue of what are the metaphors that we use for understanding our present situation. That's heightened a little bit by the COVID-19 context. And I wonder if you'd just like to take a minute to recount some of the metaphors that are used to try and understand the situation of the church in mission in the Western world.
Yeah, I would love to do that. As we listen to people, particularly leaders, a series of metaphors keep coming up to describe our situation. So one of the primary metaphors is exile. This sense that as Christians in the West, we are living now in a state of exile. Another metaphor, which is connected to that, is that we are also in a marginal place, that over against the rest of culture, Christians are somehow marginalized. Or a third kind of metaphor that's used is we are minority. And you'll see that all of these are metaphors of emotion and displacement, and they're metaphors in which there's a sense of being over against. So these are the dominant metaphors expressing both how we see ourselves, how we see our location in the world, how we see other people, in fact, and how we understand our roles. So those are the dominant metaphors that we're using right now.
And why do you think metaphor is so important in terms of shaping imagination?
Yeah, metaphors really describe how we see and understand ourselves and how we see the world in which we live. And what metaphors do is not only shape the way we see our world and ourselves, but they shape our emotional frame and responses to ourselves and the world. So metaphors are pretty powerful things. They're going to determine whether we are conscious of this or not. They're going to determine how we act. If I see myself as a participant with others in a community, in a neighborhood, I'm going to see myself in that neighborhood community very differently than if I come with the context, I'm in exile. So metaphors are very important.
Yep. So when we were writing the book, we kind of toyed with this metaphor of exile for a while, and we we felt a bit uncomfortable about it. Would you want to say a little bit more about why we found that a difficult metaphor to work with?
Yeah. I mean, it's been used for quite a while, and it's been used to create ways of understanding how to behave in late modern societies. But the problem I have with metaphors like exile is that when I sit down with church leaders in coffee shops or in restaurants, it sure doesn't look like exile to me. It looks like we are doing very well inside our societies and our cultures. And when I go and sit with someone these days on a park bench and talk about Christian life, the person opposite me may not be Christian, but they're not antagonistic. They're actually interested. So exile metaphor to me just simply doesn't fit the reality on the ground. And for me, exile carries the notion, and you may want to say more about this one, it carries the notion that we've been taken away, that something's been removed from us. I don't know about you. I don't experience that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, we're not exactly outside of our context, are we, in the way that the
No.
people of Israel were? And in that sense, one of the things that we were also talking about the other day was a completely different metaphor, and I'm just going to describe it briefly. We were playing a little bit with the idea of the Macedonian call, which I like because it's Paul's first encounter with European culture, the mainland of Europe. And here he is, he arrives in a missionary setting, and he's looking for a certain outcome. He's looking possibly to discover who is this man from Macedonia that's issued the call. And as far as we know, he never actually finds the Macedonian man, but rather what happens is that he experiences a set of completely unfamiliar circumstances. So in other words, the methodology that is used previously, visiting the synagogue, going from there, a kind of known script, is completely unavailable to him, because in this unfamiliar setting, in this unfamiliar surroundings, there is no synagogue, and consequently, what he has to do is reimagine the situation. And what happens is some completely unexpected encounters. And the first of those is, of course, the encounter with Lydia. So women, not men, is the first of those encounters. And then the second encounter is what happens in the prison where there's an earthquake. And that's why we chose this image, in a sense, not exile so much as earthquake. And the earthquake impacts not only Paul and his party pretty directly, but it impacts the whole society. And there's a sense in which maybe what we're living in is not so much exile, but earthquake. The whole of society, in a sense, is being shaken at the moment. And we are not spectators, we're participants in that. And we're trying to live out together with those with whom we share in society, to try and understand what on earth is going on, and not only what on earth is going on, but how do we live as a new community, a Christian community, in this setting in a way that brings meaning and hope and light and life to those that we share with, rather than simply trying to convey a set message to.
Yeah, that metaphor appeals to me a great deal. And certainly, as I say, exile just simply makes no sense in the context in which we find ourselves, and we're not at war. But I remember numbers of years ago being actually in an earthquake, and it was a 6.9 earthquake that killed 50 people. And I remember when the earthquake hit early in the morning, I was much younger, and the bravado I had of, oh, what was that, right? And going off to college and coming back. But I'll never forget that evening. I went to my desk and I sat down at my desk, and there was still aftershocks. But the real thing was sitting at my desk with my feet on the carpet, I could feel the earth shaking like jelly. And I mean, I had to get up and walk away. I couldn't just sit there. And I think all of us, Christians, non-Christians, we're all in this together. And what earthquake invites, which is what I experienced at that time, was that we become blessings and guests for one another. And we learn from one another and we engage with one another. That's a whole different space than being marginal or being at war or being in exile.
So I guess if that is a useful metaphor, what it's saying to us is, look, this is unfamiliar territory. It's unfamiliar to those of us who are Christians, but it's also unfamiliar to those who we seek to share life with, those in our neighborhoods, those in our communities. We're all in extremely unfamiliar territory. And in the midst of all of this, we're looking to discover what God is up to. Not that he's caused the earthquake in that direct sense, not that he's caused COVID, but in the midst of unfamiliarity, in the midst of confusion, in the midst of turmoil, in the midst of tragedy in some cases, what can we tease out of this in terms of creating a new horizon, a new sense of, what will a new future look like? It's not going to look like another version of the old. It's going to look like some kind of completely new situation. And that's the thrill of mission for me in this situation. Just simply that we don't have any roadmaps, and that's actually exciting. It's not necessarily a problem, but it's just reality. And I think one of the important things that as church leaders we have to say, there are no roadmaps.
There are no roadmaps. And what's interesting about that is that once upon a time, not very long ago, we thought there were roadmaps. And that's why some could say, we're now in exile because our roadmaps have been taken away from us. But we're now into multiple generations in which the stories of what people used to call Christendom and other things have gone and disappeared and don't make any sense anymore. The generation of my kids don't go, we've been taken away in exile. They go, we're in this new space of exile. And that's this new space that isn't about roadmaps. And that's why the earthquake metaphor makes so much more sense than I was watching the celebrations for the end of the Second World War over the weekend, in which, more in the UK, people who were 100 were standing up in their uniforms to remember what it was like when it all ended. Now, those people can say, a story's been taken away from us. But most of us watching this, it's not memory, it's something else. And that's why exile makes no sense in this new space.
Mm. So I've just been reading some of the interesting comments from those who are participating in the Facebook experience, and a couple of ones I want to just throw in. So one from a friend of mine, is the roadmap the call to come home? That's an interesting one, isn't it? The call to come home. There's not an explanation from the person who's written it, but I guess it's there is that sense of there is a narrative which has created many of the good things in the West, and we've become disconnected from that. And now we can't go back to a narrative in the 19th century, the early 20th century, but what we can do is seize hold of that narrative in new ways and begin to say, what would that narrative look like in the middle of the 21st century? Somebody else, Sally, has said, like Elijah on Horeb, God is not in the earthquake, the wind, or the fire, so listen for the whisper. I think that's great. What is God trying to whisper to us? I noticed some research just recently from Tear Fund that was saying that 25% of the British population have participated since the emergency in some form of online worship. That's pretty astonishing, actually. Now, what they've made of it, I've no idea. But is there a whisper that may be even becoming louder than a whisper, where God is saying, you know what, I'm shaking things up, and something is going to come out of this. So you know, at the very least, get ready for the unexpected. How do you get ready for the unexpected? That's a tough one.
Well, it's also in the midst of earthquake, which is an experience right now. You're right. It's really critical. What kind of whispering do we want to listen to? And it seems that as I listen, in our neighborhoods, there's all kinds of whispering going on. Underneath the fear and the anxiety, there's all sorts of whispering happening. And these may be the very ways in which we get the clues around what is God doing in this shaking up that's going on.
Well, I guess this is a conversation that hasn't got a foregone conclusion. And that's certainly not our intention anyway, to come up with a whole series of answers, 7-step strategy or whatever. But it is, there is a desire on our part to invite people into an ongoing conversation. We started that conversation last week with a pretty interesting contribution from Lord Glassman, Morris Glassman, Labour peer, who had a fascinating piece to offer. That interview, that video is still available. It's not for the faint-hearted, I think. It's a pretty extensive piece, but we would welcome people to join with us in this conversation. And we're going to be looking for ways of continuing the conversation over these next few weeks and months, partly on the pages of the journal, and partly in other events, such as the conversation we're having this afternoon. Do you want to add to that, Alan?
Yeah, and we're going to keep pursuing in the journal this question of what's next, and wanting to listen to each other in all kinds and varieties of ways. What I find interesting in the midst of this is there's numbers of comments coming up around the fact that there are no roadmaps, and people describing that as scary and exciting and energizing. And to go back to the text, the Philippian text around no roadmaps, it seems to me that one of the places where this becomes particularly poignant and touching is that many of us who are clergy have been we've been settled and used to having roadmaps. And the roadmaps have been pretty clear. There are things like we plan Sunday services, we do visitations, and in these roadmaps, all our identity gets wrapped up. And that's what's been taken away. And it seems to me that's not dissimilar to what Paul and his friends were experiencing when they come to Philippi. Because the roadmap in their head, as you pointed out, was we're going to find a synagogue, we're going to stand in the synagogue, and we're going to preach, and we're going to plant a church. And none of that was available to them. And the strangeness of the roadmap was this Gentile woman named Lydia.
Well, now, one of the thrills of this experience is the many, many comments that have come in, and we've glanced at a few and responded to a few, but we haven't been able to respond to all of them. So what we're going to do after this event is we're going to be looking at all of the comments that we've received, and we're going to be then responding in the pages of the journal in ways that we hope will be constructive, we hope will be creative, and we hope will also be invitational. So we invite you into a continuing conversation around this unique time that God has placed us in.
Yeah. I noticed Karen Reed, who's a friend, is talking about the connection between us making it our story and us being the primary agents. And we talked about this in our book, Martin. The thing about a roadmap is very often is that we now have in our hands a map and a compass that tells us where to go. And when we know where to go, we can manage it. We're the agents. And what this moment is doing is removing from us as being the central agents in what's unfolding. And we were talking a lot about that in our book, that this becomes a time when, so again, if we're in exile, we've got a whole map of what to do. We just go to Jeremiah, and Jeremiah's got all those instructions about here's what you do. Whereas in earthquake, you're all looking around going, what do we do? So a lot of this has to do with this deeply unsettling experience that we're not in control anymore. You want to comment on that at all?
Yeah. Well, there are a number of comments that I can see, but I think we need to probably pick these up in a more considered way post this conversation. And part of the challenge of this is, Alan, you and I set a target for this conversation of 15 minutes. And I noticed that we've gone a little bit over that, which is fine.
And then we let lots of people talk, and then we interact, right?
Yep, yep. So one of the comments I've seen is perhaps another way of expanding the metaphor is also to think about the prodigal and some of the images that come from that sense of returning home. Now that's different from exile, because exile is being completely removed from the situation by God, while the prodigal is God calling us home. That's slightly different, but it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, what other comments are people making? Could this, Chris James, how is this COVID-19 crisis making visible the earthquake that was already in progress? Oh, the earthquake that was already in progress. How would you see that, Martin, as an earthquake already in progress?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the fascinating things for me from the conversation with Lord Glassman last week was he has this strong theme that there's something been going on for the last 30 or 40 years, actually, underneath, which is often the way earthquakes start. There's pressure building up, and then you get some kind of shock. And he pointed to the fact there have been 3 shocks in the last 15 years or so. First of all, the 2008 financial shock, then the shock, not just in Britain with Brexit, but in many other countries where there was a Trump experience in America and a kind of nationalist movement in many other nations, and then the shock of COVID. And what those shocks have done is, in a sense, highlight what has been going on underneath for quite some time. And I think that certainly plays into the earthquake metaphor. And what he was pointing out is that sense, that deep sense that there's something wrong at a very fundamental level with a society in which significant numbers of people have felt marginalized, have felt left behind, have felt excluded, are wanting to say, stop. We've got to reimagine the way in which we're functioning as a society. And some of the themes that are coming up in relation to that, and some of the themes you hear in the COVID crisis, is we're rediscovering the things that really matter to us. And the things that really matter are to do with our primary relationships in family, in friendship, in neighborhood. Place has suddenly assumed a new kind of importance. We're only able to walk a certain distance, and we suddenly see our immediate environment in a completely different way. we also reimagine our relationship with the land, with food, with places, with shops, actually. And also that there's a new kind of hero in this situation. And the heroes are those who are very often poorly paid, but now the refuse collectors and the hospital porters and the delivery people and those who work in shops, those who have perhaps been unseen for so long, suddenly become center stage, and we clap them. Here in Britain, we clap them every Thursday night. It's not just the nurses we clap, but it's a much wider circle than that. And we want to say to these people, thank you. And that's, I've had some great conversations with people in those situations, and the impact that that thank you has had on people like refuse collectors, it's just amazing, actually. And it's kind of a redefinition of what really matters in life, what really is the center of life, and in a sense, how fragile life is actually, and what we really need to be celebrating in the midst of all of that. It's fascinating.
Well, there's something very powerful there, because there's a sense in which the Spirit of God is saying to us through doctors, stay home, and stay in place. That's the language that's used. And home and place are actually really powerful metaphors for us at this moment, because that's not about exile, some foreign place that you've got to adapt to. It's not about that at all. It's actually, to use different metaphors, this is an opportunity to awaken to home, to place, to where we are. And to, somebody had mentioned in Celtic spirituality, this notion of peregrinatio, the moving about. And it's the invitation to move about again in the place where we find ourselves, in our home, and to awaken ourselves to what's happening and going on there. That's a radically different kind of imagination than being in exile or being on the margins. That's about being among and being with in a moment of earthquake. And so in many senses, the language of home and place and where we are is critically important to these earthquakes that are going on.
Mm. Somebody said, can we summarize again just what was the paradigm in the Philippian situation? And so just to remind you, the immediate context prior to arriving in Philippi was Paul's vision in the night of the man from Macedonia, come over and help us. And so Paul sets sail. He doesn't land in Philippi, he lands somewhere else. Eventually finds himself in Philippi, and we're not quite sure, the account in Acts doesn't tell us precisely why he went to Philippi, apart from the fact it was a principal city. But in one of those lovely little phrases in Acts of the Apostle, we stayed there for some days. I'd love to know how long that was. How long was some days? And there's a sense of complete uncertainty about what the mission is in this situation. As we've said already, there's no synagogue, which was the usual methodology in Asia Minor. There's no synagogue. So they find this place of prayer, which is interesting, and they encounter a group of women, one who was very significant, Lydia, but they go on from there, and the church is founded in that place with three groups of people. There's the group of people surrounding Lydia. There's a group of people that surround the young slave girl who has a demon cast out of her. And then there's the jailer and his household, who are obviously terrified about what's going to happen as a result of the earthquake in the prison. Now, if you were planning a church plant, would you do it in this way? Are these the constituent elements that you would think in your mind are going to comprise the church plant? I mean, it's pretty clear that Paul is in extraordinarily unfamiliar territory, and yet there's a confidence behind this that somehow God is the agent. God is in charge here. Something is going to come out of this that's extraordinarily important. And yeah, something is founded out of completely unfamiliar circumstances, the other side of the earthquake, that Paul couldn't have planned, couldn't have expected, and yet something happens because God is the agent. Paul's role is to say, in effect, God, what are you up to? And how can we construct something out of this which is just completely unfamiliar, completely uncertain? And so that's why, for me, that is a helpful paradigm, because I do think that we're in such a situation, such a time where, you know, everything is pretty unfamiliar. But it's not just unfamiliar to those of us in the church. It's increasingly unfamiliar to everybody in society. We're all going to have to find a way through this. And our role as Christians is to say, in the midst of all of this, God remains the agent.
Yeah. I wonder whether, as you were speaking, I was thinking that in a bit of a similar way, Paul gets to Philippi. There's no synagogue around, so the normal habits are, in ways, are not there. In a similar way, so much of our church practices have been taken away from us. Mm-hmm. And the expectation that on Sundays or Wednesdays or some other ways we meet with each other and we do our church thing, it's all been taken away. And what that means is, just as no synagogue meant that Paul could meet this woman named Lydia, what it means is that we find ourselves now talking to people in our community that we would never have planned on talking with before, and all kinds of conversations are bubbling up and shaping right in our own local spaces. That's what the earthquake has brought about. It's just fascinating what's going on. I'm just trying to check out other people's points and questions. David Isgrove is asking, God is more than an agent, Martin. Isn't he the instigator? That's a tricky piece. Do you want to engage that or not? I mean, is God the instigator of this virus? What is God the instigator of? That takes a lot of discernment. What other questions have we got here? In Philippi, Paul had to consciously seek out people of peace in new ways. My experience is that this has been happening accidentally via social media during the lockdown. They were discovering other kinds of people of peace in the midst of this. Yeah. Any other things that you want to see there, Martin, you want to respond to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole, so many comments actually. It's difficult to seize on any one or two. But yeah, I think there is broadly that sense and realization probably that this situation has brought us a whole host of new opportunities. And I suppose one of the tragedies would be if post-lockdown, we simply try and revert to the old patterns. There's a whole new horizon opened up here, especially in terms of people that we've connected with through the pandemic that we mustn't let go of, and somehow we want these conversations to continue. I was on a call with church leaders from Athens and Frankfurt and Budapest and so on just recently, this last few days, and the same theme was coming through in all of these huge cities, that numerous church leaders are encountering huge numbers of people who not only have they got the willingness and interest to have a conversation, but miraculously now they've got the time for those conversations.
Yeah, yeah.
And it would be dreadful if we lost that opportunity to really pursue those conversations. Yeah, I think there's a whole new circle of friends and acquaintances and strangers who are coming into the orbit, the broader orbit of our churches. The other thing I notice is that many of our church members, if not all of them actually, are involved in local WhatsApp groups. And I noticed that the WhatsApp groups are causing people to get to know their neighbors in ways that just never happened before. I've seen lots of comments on WhatsApp. I didn't know anybody in my neighborhood previously. Now I do know them. Well, again, it would be wonderful if we could see that continue. It's almost as if in the midst of the pandemic, the initiative has passed to the ordinary people in our congregations. And without a plan, without being asked to, they've actually taken the initiative in ways that are just quite amazing. So for years, we've been encouraging people to get to know your neighbors. And we haven't been very successful in organizing that. But now suddenly it's happened in a way that we never expected. So I think that's just amazing.
This question of people are saying, and again, people are finding what are the metaphors we can use. This there's no going back to normal. That's people are using language like that as a way of saying we just don't know what it is that's going to emerge before us, and that becomes clear every day as we listen to the ways in which this virus is present. We think we've got control over it, and then we don't. And yet at the same time, it's like, how do we make the temple work again? We're seeing all kinds of posts on, for example, this is a real one, 27 things you need to be able to do to get ready for the post-coronavirus world. And those 27 things, this is North American, Martin, not UK. Those 27 things are, how do you move from social media to opening churches? How do you move from all of this sort of stuff, which misses completely? How do we, particularly as past clergy and leaders, how do we spend our time with our leaders, inviting them to reflect upon the encounters and the stories and the experiences that they are having with people in their communities, as you talked about it, and then asking the question, what does this mean for what we take with us? So rather than getting stuck on how do you open a church building up so you can have 50 people and it spread apart, focus on the question, what are we learning together? What are we discovering in our conversations with people? So these are some of the shifts that are happening, certainly over here, because already people are starting to plan what it will look like when we reopen churches, which is going to happen. But when you read the Philippian experience, you go, do we really need to do that? Other comments and questions you're seeing? So one of the metaphors is cartographer, and moving about and navigating, which I think is good. Is how do you navigate in this new space? Yeah, I know some of you have just joined us in the last few minutes. We're probably about 5 or 6 minutes from beginning to close this down. What we were seeking to do was to invite us into thinking about what are the metaphors? What are the fresh metaphors that can help us as leaders, to use your metaphor, navigate this new world in which we find ourselves? And we were proposing, built around Philippians, the metaphor of earthquake, in which all of us find ourselves, and seeking to understand together, rather than exile, which is being taken away from somewhere and over against. So that's been the shape of the conversation.
Yeah. So just pressing that issue of cartography, of navigation a little bit further. I mean, I think there was something quite interesting in Paul's journey from this point on. And if we could press it just a little bit further, it's interesting when he gets to Athens, that actually the background to his sermon on the Hill of Mars was in fact a pandemic, because there's a whole story that comes from the poets that Paul alludes to. The pandemic was halted in a particular way that gave rise to the statue to the unknown God, because they attributed the saving of the city of Athens from a plague to some kind of unknown God. And so that's the imagery that Paul grabs a hold of. And so I think, you know, if there is any kind of navigation in this kind of situation, it is a navigation that causes us to look for the unique opportunities in the situations in which we find ourselves. In other words, there's not a one size fits all right across the Western world, but rather it's much more a sense of, do you know what, God is probably up to something a little bit unique in each neighborhood in which we find ourselves. And it's more of an orientation or the way in which we conduct ourselves to be listening for what God is up to in situation after situation after situation. And what fascinates me at the moment is just the sheer variety of stories and encounters that are coming back to us. God is doing some unexpected things in some unexpected places. Sometimes it's with the people, again, that we would least expect, just as in Philippi. Sometimes it's with migrants. Sometimes it's with those who are marginalized in society in a whole variety of ways. But God is displacing sometimes the highly established, and that's not a knock at any particular denomination or church, but it's just amazing how God is raising up new forms of church, new expressions of church, which are not called, I think, to completely displace that which already exists, but to live in a creative relationship with that which exists, because we're all called into this new space, the other side of earthquake, to say, oh my goodness, none of us have got all the answers here. Not the new churches, not the existing churches, none of us have got all the answers, but together we might find some.
Someone had asked the question, what about the diaspora? And as you remember, all of you listening, the diaspora is what comes out of the defeat of Judah and then Israel, and the fact that in the deportation of people to Babylon and other places, most of those Jews never return, but begin to set up communities and lives all over the known world, Alexandria, Rome, other places, diaspora. What about diaspora as a metaphor for our moment? And I would say, and Martin, you and I have not talked about this, that I don't think that's a helpful metaphor. And part of what happens is that, and I do this myself, when we find ourselves in challenging spaces, we go to the scriptures to look for images and metaphors that might be directive to us. But what if this is one of those times when the metaphors and stories that we find in Scripture are not going to be the most helpful for where we are? What if, for example, that the metaphors for our time are not exile or diaspora, but the rediscovery of place, and that it's part of our calling in discerning God is to hear what's being said to us, as I said earlier, by the medical people. Reside in place. That place being where we live, home. That if we begin to settle into place and space, but this time without church buildings, what might we see and what might we discern? That's not diaspora, that's not exile. That is something that is very deeply present in the Scriptures. It's called place. It's called parish. It's called discovering again where we are. So those are other ways of looking at the metaphors that we're using.
Yeah. Although it's interesting that there are diaspora peoples all across the West on a scale that we've never seen before. And I think the image that you're kicking against, in a sense, Alan, is the idea that the whole Christian community is a diaspora, and I understand why you're not comfortable with that. But
well, it's these are all metaphors of what I will call white middle class privilege.
Yeah, well, just to come back to the diaspora people, because I think they're also important.
They are.
The most important thing about the diaspora people is they're not going back to their places of origin. They are part of the New West. And that's actually pretty important, because one of the things that I think those of us who are residing as Christians already in this continent or in the West generally can say to the diaspora peoples is, let's work with you to help you find your place, to come back to place. Mm-hmm. So diaspora needs also to find its place in this new society, because they are the new Europeans, they are the new North Americans, they are the new Westerners, joining forces with us in trying to make sense of what God is doing in particular locations. I think that's certainly a challenge for people in the diaspora, that they don't simply end up as one generation, single ethnicities, but that actually over time they find a place to make a significant contribution to the whole shape of what we're facing the other side of the earthquake.
I would totally agree with you, Martin, and that my point, though, is without disagreeing with you at all, there is huge diaspora presence in the West, but these metaphors that keep getting raised, these metaphors of exile and marginalization, these are the metaphors largely of white Euro-tribal middle-class people who suddenly feel like, as Christians, their place of power has been taken away.
Yeah. Sally's made a great comment. She said, we might be in the same place and the same storm, but not necessarily in the same boat. I think that's actually quite a helpful way of describing it. Yeah, exactly. We're not all in the same boat,
yeah,
but in this same context of confusion and disorientation, which is, yeah, a helpful place to be in a way.
Yeah. Anything else we need to engage with in terms of the questions? It's
Oh, somebody else has made an interesting point. Observation that Isaac Newton discovered the theory of gravity while isolated in his home because of the plague. Right. It's amazing what creativity comes out of the plague. Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to be working for quite a while on what are the metaphors that will shape how we respond and be God's people in this new space where we find ourselves. What are the metaphors for living as God's people when we don't have roadmaps? And in some sense, we are quite naturally predisposed to keep wanting to find a metaphor that gives us a roadmap. And just like, I mean, when Paul and his companions go outside the gate, they are literally without roadmaps. They are literally, I don't want to be inappropriate, stumbling around trying to figure out what to do. And it's only in that context of not having roadmaps that they, I don't know how it happens. How do these Jewish males end up sitting, talking to Gentile women? That's the amazement of not having roadmaps.
Well, I guess the invitation I'd like to issue to all those who've been joining with us in this last period of time, this last hour, is to say, how about rereading Philippians, or rereading Acts rather, that story of how Paul came to Philippi, both the immediate precursor to that and then what happened in Philippi, and just asking the question, Lord, as I'm reading this, what are you saying to me by the Spirit for what might be helpful in our time, the other side of this earthquake, which we call the pandemic?
And I would encourage you, I see Chris James, for example, is talking about, these are the kind of metaphors we need, that in the journal, particularly in the Facebook page, as we continue to shape this conversation of what's next, I just really encourage you to say, here are some metaphors to think about. And we will find ways of helping people into conversation around that, because I don't think any of us are wanting to claim that we know what it needs to look like. I think we're wanting to say we have a sense of what we don't need and what's not going to help us. But I think what Martin and I are saying with earthquake, let's talk about this. Is this a helpful way of engaging in new metaphors? But we'd encourage you to keep at this as we listen and learn from one another. Well, I think, Martin, it's probably coming close to the hour. Certainly want to thank everybody for your participation. You're willing to spend time with us in this conversation and bit of a dialogue. We've recorded this and we'll make it available on the journal website. And we just encourage you to keep in conversation around this question of what's next. Martin, anything you'd like to say at this point?
No, I think I'd echo that. And I just noticed a comment from somebody who says that in this time of isolation, they actually look forward to church more now. And they end with this lovely comment, less busy, more attentive. And I think that's actually a good way to conclude. I think maybe that's exactly what God is calling us to. Let's be less busy, but more attentive.
So to all of you, either at the beginning of your day or in the middle of it or the end of it, be blessed by being less busy and more attentive. God be with you. And thanks so much. Bye-bye.